In the spring of 1944, an entire army stood on the edge of starvation. Surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from the world. Roads were severed. Supplies were gone. The enemy believed collapse was only a matter of time. Yet instead of retreating, these forces chose to stand and fight, betting everything on a radical idea: survival from the air. Over 150,000 men and 11,000 animals would depend on a single lifeline that could vanish with weather, fuel, or enemy fire. How did a siege in the jungles of India become a turning point of the war? And what happened when the sky became the only hope? To see how an army ended up fighting for survival from the sky, we have to go back to where the collapse first began. The road to Imphal siege began years earlier. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and rapidly expanded across East Asia, seizing British territories including Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. By early 1942, Rangoon had fallen, and Allied forces began a grueling retreat. Over 5 months, British and Indian troops withdrew roughly 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers across mountains and jungle into India. It was one of the longest fighting retreats in British military history. The shock of that collapse forced a transformation. In November 1943, Southeast Asia Command was formed under Admiral Lord Louis Mount, replacing India Command and injecting new energy into the theater. The old policy retreat, when cut off, was abandoned. Units would now stand firm, rely on air supply if surrounded, and fight through the monsoon. Lieutenant General William Slim, commanding the 14th Army, rebuilt morale and doctrine. He emphasized jungle training and created defensive boxers all-around positions designed to hold out under encirclement while being sustained by air. It was a radical shift, and soon it would be tested at scale. Across the frontier, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi saw opportunity. By 1944, the RF was operating aggressively from India, threatening Japanese positions in Burma. Mutaguchi concluded that only an invasion of northeastern India could eliminate that aerial threat and create a buffer zone. His plan Operation Yugo called for capturing Imphal, cutting the road at Kohima, and disrupting air supply routes, including those supporting China. 3 Japanese divisions would advance, the 33rd toward Imphal from the south, the 15th from the northeast, and the 31st against Kohima. The offensive began on the 8th of March 1944, as Japanese troops crossed the Chindwin River into India. But the plan carried a fatal assumption. Japanese forces would depend heavily on capturing British supplies. Their own logistics stretched through dense Burmese jungle over long, fragile lines. If the advance stalled, hunger would follow. Events moved quickly. Japanese forces pressed forward, and on the 29th of March, they cut the road between Imphal and Kohima, isolating the British the 4th Corps. By early April, both Kohima and Imphal were surrounded. Inside Imphal, 4 divisions and supporting troops concentrated on the plain. In total, approximately 155,000 men and 11,000 animals depended on regular supply to remain combative. To sustain them through June would require 540 tons of supplies per day. This was not a temporary disruption. Land communications were severed. The Japanese expected the 4th Corps to collapse under pressure, starvation, and artillery assault. From that moment onward, Imphal's survival depended on a single, fragile condition: the sky had to remain open. By late March 1944, Lieutenant General Jeffrey Schoons faced arithmetic that could not be ignored. The 4th Corps had reserves for roughly 30 days at current rates of consumption. That calculation did not include heavier fighting, nor the coming monsoon. He immediately cut rations for men and animals by 1/3 and ordered strict fuel economy. Brigadier L. Telup, his chief quartermaster, directed that continuous and energetic steps will be taken to ensure maximum economy. Survival now depended on disciplined scarcity. The first formal appeal made the situation unmistakable. On the 11th of April, Lope requested clarity about daily tonnage and sortie rates, stressing that units had to be kept up to strength. There was uncertainty about weather, aircraft availability, and competing operational demands. Yet without predictable air delivery, the 4th Corps could not plan. It was not merely a matter of comfort. It was the difference between cohesion and collapse. On the 17th of April, senior staffs gathered at Camilla to design a sustained air operation. The code name was Operation Stamina. Calculations showed that 155,000 men and 11,000 animals required 540 tons of supplies per day to remain effective through June. To achieve this, an Anglo-American fleet of 232 C-47 transport aircraft was assembled from Bengal airfields. The burden of an entire field corps would rest on twin engines and disciplined scheduling. Operation Stamina began on the 18th of April with 75 flights into Imphal. The next day, more than 100 aircraft landed, an unprecedented surge. Between the 19 and the 23rd of April, daily landings ranged from 106 to 166 aircraft. The tempo was extraordinary. Crates of ammunition, sacks of grain, medical supplies, fuel drums, even mail descended steadily onto the plane. But impressive as the numbers were, they did not yet meet the calculated requirement. In its first 12 days, the airlift delivered 1,250 tons, less than needed. Some aircraft arrived empty due to loading errors. Others fought weather systems and cloud banks over the mountain ranges separating Bengal from Imphal Plain. The geography itself resisted the operation. The approaches were narrow and treacherous, and navigational difficulties compounded delays. Each missed delivery widened the gap between demand and supply. Imphal Plain contained 6 airfields, 4 very fair weather strips with dirt runways. Only 2 were paved and all-weather capable. Congestion quickly became a limiting factor. There were insufficient hard stands. Aircraft sometimes waited to unload. Truck drivers occasionally damaged transports in collisions. To streamline the process, Bengal fields were reorganized into single commodity loading points, while every usable strip in Imphal accepted deliveries. Efficiency became a weapon. Then came the forecast that haunted planners. The monsoon was expected around the 21st of May once the rains began. 4 of the 6 airfields would likely become largely unusable due to mud and flooding. Daily sorties could be cut in half. Against a projected requirement of 37,360 tons through the 31st of July, only 21,995 tons might realistically arrive. The anticipated deficiency, 15,365 tons, was not theoretical. It meant divisions would slowly starve. Without land communications reopened by mid-June, Lope warned that approximately 2 divisions and part of the Corps' troops would have to be flown out. The airlift that sustained the army might also become the means of evacuation. Imphal could hold temporarily, but without relief, the 4th Corps would begin to shrink. Its combat power reduced, not by enemy assault, but by diminishing calories and fuel. On Tay ground, austerity shaped every action. Artillery firing was restricted to 6 rounds per gun per day, unless headquarters authorized more. Fuel was rationed so severely that trucks operated in tandem to conserve oil and gasoline. Movement was minimized. Engines were started only when essential. Every gallon mattered as much as every shell. Rations fell below the level required for active troops. By mid-May, hunger spread across formations. Scaling hills became a problem, and patrols were given extra food, recalled a lieutenant of the 17th Indian Division. We smoked a lot to stop thinking of hunger. The physical strain was constant, amplified by heat and exhaustion. A staff officer later summarized the atmosphere with stark simplicity. We had the means to ensure survival, but no more. Life during the siege of Imphal was strenuous for all, and devoid of comfort, and it imposed a strain on the nerves. The army existed on the edge of sufficiency, sustained but never secure. June brought a deeper crisis. Despite weather disruption, an average of 259 tons per day arrived between the 4th and the 15th of June. Yet fuel stocks were estimated to run dry within just over a week. On the 20th of June, the 4th Corps reported that depot stocks were practically exhausted, and that without daily petrol deliveries, it would be necessary to consume even the smallest reserves. It was the lowest point of the siege. The transports continued because the sky remained controlled. Our AF-221 group, operating Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Vengeances from Imphal, maintained air supremacy. BT Batlayas and the RAF had flown over 25,000 sorties, destroying 33 Japanese fighters, with 22 probable and 61 damaged, for the loss of 8. Japanese air interference with transport aircraft remained limited. Without this dominance, the airlift would have been impossible. A Japanese assessment later conceded the consequence. Allied air supply permitted ground forces in Burma to consolidate their positions without being forced to retreat, and thus rendered our infiltration and encircling tactics abortive. Encirclement had been a proven method in previous campaigns. At Imphal, it faltered under aircraft wings. The scale of the air effort was immense. During the battle, nearly 19,000 tons of supplies were flown in, along with over 12,000 men. Approximately 13,000 casualties were evacuated, and 43,000 non-combatants were removed from the region. The airlift did not merely sustain combat units. It reorganized the entire human landscape of the battlefield. The contrast was brutal. The Japanese 5th 10th Army, numbering about 85,000, ultimately lost 53,000 dead and missing. Their offensive had depended on captured supplies that never materialized. As shortages deepened under monsoon conditions, starvation spread through their ranks. British losses at Imphal totaled approximately 12,500. At Imphal, the decisive battlefield was not only the jungle ridges or the dusty roads, it was the air corridor between Bengal and the Imphal plain. As long as engines roared overhead and transports touched down, the 4th Corps endured. If they had stopped, the plane would have fallen. B-Bain to June 1944. The 4th Corps stood at the edge of exhaustion. Stocks at the Royal Indian Army Supply Corps depot were reported as practically exhausted, and oil reserves were expected to run dry within days. Without daily petrol deliveries, even the smallest reserves would have to be consumed. The monsoon had already begun to disrupt operations, grounding aircraft and reducing deliveries at the most critical moment. It was the lowest point of the siege. Then, relief came not from the air but along the road that had been silent for months. On 22 June, forces advancing from Kohima linked up with the 4th Corps, reopening land, communications, and effectively ending the siege of Imphal. The encirclement that had begun in early April was broken. The outcome carried strategic weight far beyond the plain. The Japanese 5th 10th Army suffered catastrophic losses, 53,000 dead and missing, marking one of the largest defeats in Japanese military history. Mutaguchi's offensive collapsed under the combined strain of Allied resistance, air superiority, and logistical failure. For William Slim, the lesson was unmistakable. The campaign had been a joint land-air war. It was, he later wrote, as much a victory for the air forces as for the army. Imphal and Kohima became the turning point of the Burma campaign. From defensive survival, the 14th Army moved to offensive momentum, opening the way for the reconquest of Burma. But beyond strategy and statistics, the memory of Imphal remains more intimate. Men looked to the sky each day. Every C-47 engine meant food, ammunition, fool another, sunrise. Every landing was proof that they had not been abandoned. In Imphal, the war was not decided only on jungle-covered hills or shattered roads. It was decided on the wings of aircraft that refused to stop flying.